In this lecture, we're going to look at the really remarkable material from the ancient Roman city at Ostia. But before we get into what we're going to see, I wanted to make a plug for visiting Ostia. If, as I hope happens, at some point you find yourself in Rome, I'd urge you to take the time to go out to Ostia. You can take the local train out. It costs like $1.50. It goes straight out to the site, and there you will find almost a complete Roman city, all laid out, excavated, and open for you to just explore. You can take the train out, spend the morning there, have lunch in the cafeteria on site, visit the little museum and the bookshop, and be back in Rome by 2 o'clock. Or take the train two stops further out and go to the beach. And almost nobody does this. Almost nobody goes out to Ostia. It's close, it's cheap, it's remarkable. And so if you get a chance to go to Rome, please consider visiting Ostia. I just think it's spectacular. Well, on to the show. Ostia is a separate city from Rome, and yet its identity has always been based on its relationship to the capital. As Rome's first colony, founded in 338 BC, it was placed at the mouth, the Os in Latin, of the Tiber River, initially to protect Rome from attacks coming up the river from the sea. But it also served the city as its trading base. That is, this was the place that all international trade came through on its way up the Tiber. In the period that we're looking at here, AD 120, the same period that we toured Rome in the previous two lectures, Ostia is still there after 350 years, supplying Rome with all of the bulk commodities a city of over 1 million people needed. Now, in some ways, it's less a separate city of 50,000 people than an extension of Rome itself. It might be useful to think of a comparison to a larger U.S. city, where Ostia would be the dock and warehouse district as a satellite of the major city. For example, Ostia doesn't have any of the largest scale entertainment venues that Rome does. No Colosseum, no Circus Maximus, and no stadium. To experience those urban amenities, the people of Ostia must have had to travel to Rome itself. Ostia does, however, preserve a distinct subculture that sets it apart from Rome. For example, unlike the vast gap in wealth found in Rome, at Ostia, we seem to have a community of working class and what I'll refer to as middle class people. Its position along the Tiber, near the mouth of the river, meant that Ostia existed for trade, and that is mainly for trade coming into Rome, although the great cargo ships that supplied Rome moved in both directions, in and out of port, with smaller boats traveling round trips up and down the Tiber. Ostia suffered a great fire in AD 115, in which about 100,000 square feet of the city were burned. Rather than rebuild it as it was, the Emperor Hadrian took charge of much of the rebuilding, and as a first step, brought in 100,000 cubic yards of fill. Now, I should say Hadrian didn't do this personally, but he ordered it to be done. This fill was packed on the rubble of the existing city. So the city burns, they clear the site, they just knock everything down and level it, and then they put this fill on top, pack it on the rubble, so that the new city was built at least a yard higher than the old one, which was to protect it from floods. In addition, the new buildings that are built on this larger, higher site were built of brick-faced concrete to protect them from fire. So already two of the great urban catastrophes, fire and flood, Hadrian has tried to lessen here with the rebuilding. Well, looking at a map of Ostia, it makes it very clear how much of its identity comes from the shipping industry. The industry physically dominates the city, taking up large areas of land along the coast and the riverbank, of course, but really permeating throughout the city. Massive warehouses, offices, and storage facilities for food, as well as other bulk commodities, such as marble and timber that were needed in Rome, are found all across the city. Shipping is clearly the leading industry, but the distribution of all these warehouses around Ostia is actually surprising. Many of these commodities are dangerous if large amounts are improperly stored or handled. Fires are a frequent, really a nightly occurrence in ancient cities. And oil warehouses provide the fuel for fires to spread quickly and to burn at very high temperatures. It's a risk storing all of this imported olive oil, for example, in residential areas. But of all these commodities, grain is the worst. If improperly stored, grain can burn or explode, both of which happen with some frequency even in modern times. So placing these commodities in huge amounts around the city could have been dangerous. Some of these storage facilities were not buildings, but large lots exploited for wine or olive oil storage. These liquids were kept in massive terracotta vessels, about 6 feet in height, that held about 300 to 400 gallons each of wine or olive oil. And these vessels are buried up to their rims to provide a form of temperature control. So buried underground, they're at a consistent temperature. In terms of sheer size, however, the grain warehouses are the largest facilities of the shipping industry in Ostia. Grain, almost all of the grain for the city of Rome at this time, 120 AD, comes from overseas, from Egypt and North Africa. Altogether, perhaps 8 million bushels a year coming into Ostia and going up to Rome. And that doesn't include what's coming in just to feed the people in Ostia themselves. These warehouses often take up an entire city block with a brick-faced concrete structure 2 or 3 stories tall. One of these in particular at Ostia has a formal entrance, and the names of the owners are over the door on a marble plaque. This storage building, it's in Latin horea, that means warehouses, because it's divided into separate spaces inside, was owned by 2 freedmen. Epagathus and Epaphroditus are their names. Freedmen means that they're former slaves, and those names are not Roman, they're not Latin anyway, they're Greek. These men give us an example of just how rich former slaves of the period could be. This warehouse not only has this marble plaque above the front door, the interior has black and white mosaic floors and small shrines. It's the highest end grain warehouse ever found in the Roman world. Well, in addition to the physical dominance of the shipping industry, its importance was seen in other ways as well. Unlike Rome, where buildings were dedicated by wealthy elites, and inscriptions on marble plaques or on the bases of statues frequently name emperors or senators as the benefactors of public spaces, buildings, statues, infrastructure improvements, and so on. Here at Ostia, dedications were made by professional organizations of workers, and the plaques named the shippers or warehouse workers. Now, it's tempting, and a lot of scholars give into this temptation, to refer to these professional organizations as unions. In a lot of ways they are. They serve the same purposes as unions. They're collectives of workers who can negotiate together and have a common purpose. But I'm not sure that we can really compare them directly to modern unions. Nevertheless, what we have are huge numbers of these professional organizations for virtually every profession. For example, shipbuilders, grain measurers, the guys who measure the grain as it comes off, even the men whose job it was, and this is an actual job, a profession, to dive into the harbor and to collect goods that were lost during loading or unloading of ships, had their own professional organization. Just as an aside, these guys whose job it was to dive into the water and pull stuff back off, their name in Latin is urinator, which unfortunately, when you see it in print, looks like it reads urinator, but it's urinator, these divers. Well, all of these groups gave back to the city. And all of this was driven by the import-export business, which also supported approximately 10% of the working population that was employed in construction at this time, about 120 AD. Now, I think in any community, you can gain a sense of how it defines itself by the largest buildings in town. These are sometimes the biggest industries that employ the most people, factories, for example. But in other times, there are other large buildings that communities have created on their own to literally and I think deliberately define themselves. If you go through rural Indiana, for example, you will find tremendous basketball gymnasia that are built in small towns that hold far more people than you will find in the communities, but that these people wanted to build as a statement of the importance of basketball in their high schools. But placement of these buildings is also key. You can tell what a community values by examining what they support or what they turn public space over to. One of the standard entertainment buildings in a Roman city was a theater. Now, these are almost invariably constructed with an attached quadriporticus, that is, a four-sided portico surrounding a rectangular piazza that was considered an integral part of the theater complex. The porticos were used by theatergoers as places for shade and to stretch their legs between plays. A normal day of plays means going out to see 4 plays, usually 3 tragedies and a comedy. So there's a need to get up every once in a while. The porticos also served as a place for shops to sell food and drink to the theatergoers. At Pompeii, after a major earthquake, the quadriporticus at the theater was walled off from the theater and turned over to the local gladiatorial school. This is a key element in community identity, and I think a very clear example of what the Pompeians valued by turning valuable civic space over to the use of the gladiatorial school. At Ostia, the theater portico was turned over to the use of businesses, those that conducted imports and exports. It became their headquarters, and each of the shipping groups from a different city had its own small headquarters room around the edges of the piazza under the porticos, in spaces that were originally shops, those shops that would, sell food and drink to the theatergoers. Bold and clear black and white floor mosaics that show simple images related to shipping, such as a lighthouse, a ship, a grain measure, and so forth, mark most of these headquarters. A few of these incorporate the names of the cities that traded with Ostia, and one has an elephant, just an elephant. This could be the headquarters of big game animal importers, or it could just be a group that liked elephants, or it could be a group from someplace associated with elephants, such as Carthage. Well, the major building stock at Ostia was the kind of apartment found in the large 3, 4, or even 5-story brick apartment buildings called insulae, Latin for islands, that fill the blocks, as seen in the best examples from this period at Rome. Unlike Rome, however, there were neither tenements nor palaces here in Ostia. There weren't even any of the atrium-style elite residences as found at Pompeii. The housing here at Ostia is good, but it's neither spectacular nor wretched. This is housing for the working lower and middle class. There is no evidence of the desperately poor, which raises the question, where are they? Where are the poor? Why are they not apparent here at Ostia? Now, it could be that they're in Rome, where there were benefactors such as the emperor and the wealthy elite, senators and so forth. They could participate in the alimenta and a chance for survival from beneficence. Or perhaps, more intriguingly I think, the booming trade, commerce, and construction in the city of Ostia meant that more people here worked more regularly. I think that this is an intriguing and important question for cities, both in the ancient world and today. Does Ostia represent a city that eliminated poverty through full employment? Or does it represent a city that had full employment because the desperately poor found themselves better off somewhere else? In this debate, part of the calculus that we cannot neglect is the power of the professional organizations here, these unions. I suspect these unions kept wages high enough and protected their workers well enough that jobs were not taken by slave or non-union labor. Their power in the city seems pretty clear. I think I was thinking about an anecdote here, an event that occurred to me actually at the university fairly recently. I was riding the bus home at the university, and like every university I've ever seen, mine has something of an edifice complex. We're always building buildings. And One of the guys on the bus as we rode home was a laborer at one of the construction sites there, and he had just gotten hired. He was a man about my age, middle-aged, and he was an unskilled laborer on this construction site. It was his first construction job, and he was giddy and told everybody in the bus about his good fortune because he just got hired as a laborer, making as much as many of the professors at the university made. Thanks to prevailing wage laws, this guy in middle age could in fact have a middle-class lifestyle, really working as a laborer in construction. And I always think about him as sort of the model for the people here at Ostia. Well, back to Ostia. The ground floors of these insulae, or the insula buildings, have shops that face the street all around, with shop owners or renters living above these ground floor shops. The upper floors are apartments of various sizes, which get progressively smaller the higher they are. But once again, they still do not become the sort of tenements that we find in Rome. They're still concrete buildings in good shape and not terribly high. Most of the buildings, in fact, have a central courtyard that provides light and air to the rooms of the upper stories. So what you have, when you look at it from the outside, an insula looks like a solid city block. But what you really have is sort of a skin of rooms all the way running around the edge of the block up against the sidewalk. And you pass through to an open courtyard in the center. Some of these courtyards had marble fountains and other very attractive features. Many of the apartments were lavishly decorated with wall paintings in many of the rooms, and some of the upper stories had balconies on the outside and large windows on the interior as well. Now, an interesting variation on the insula is a complex at Ostia known as the garden houses, and this is a name given by the excavators, the garden houses. We don't know what it was called in antiquity. These are 4-story tall buildings in the center of blocks that are ringed by a large garden with another line of buildings around the edge of the property. So from the outside, from the street, the entire thing looks like a large insula. All right, but you've got that narrow line of buildings, and inside a great deal more open space than you would have in a normal insula. And in the center of the whole thing, these garden houses, which are surrounded by gardens. We believe about 1,200 people lived in these dwellings. The central buildings have 8 apartments per floor. Each apartment has an average of, and I've done the math here, so I'm going to give you the exact numbers, 2,368 square feet, or about 220 square meters of space. To compare that, the average that I could find for a 1-bedroom apartment in New York is about 750 square feet. So these are large. These are larger than a lot of freestanding houses that you find in American cities. These were plumbed for running water, and the gardens also featured large fountains. The economics of such buildings make it very likely that these were not apartments rented to families by a landlord, but essentially what we would refer to as condominiums, individually owned units in a larger complex. The inhabitants would have been fairly well off for Ostia, but nowhere near the level of luxurious housing enjoyed by the elite in Rome. That lower level of luxury at Ostia is also evident in public facilities. There was, however, a very nice bath complex next to the Forum that was paid for by the emperor. It was grand in scale and decoration, and it even included a marble-seated large public latrine, which everybody likes public bathrooms. The other baths in town, however, were probably neighborhood baths, and rather than being paid for by emperors or senators, those professional organizations I mentioned earlier stepped up and paid for them. My favorite, and it's kind of sad that I have a favorite neighborhood bath complex, but anyway, my favorite is the so-called Baths of the Mule Drivers, with the dedication for the baths set into the floor of the large black and white mosaic floor in the main room of the baths, along with the expected thematically integrated figures of sea creatures and swimmers that seem to be swimming in circles around the room. There's another line of very different figures. These are mule carts being driven by the mule drivers who paid for the baths. These generic figures of hard-working mule drivers are arranged among the sea creatures and swimmers. They look rather like they're running a race, although they probably made their money transporting goods between the harbor and the warehouses. As at Rome and Pompeii, Ostia has a surfeit of popinae, those small wine and snack shops. These are on the ground floors of insulae, often on the corners. And they're popular places for Romans to have a drink or a small meal. Ostians could eat or drink either standing at a bar counter or seated at a table, often in an interior or adjacent room. Popinae of various sizes and styles are found scattered throughout the city, sometimes across the street from each other, particularly the ones on the corners, apparently competing for business. When it came to religious identity, however, Ostia departed dramatically from the pattern seen at Pompeii or even Rome, very close to it. As the major harbor for the capital, many foreigners and foreign ideas came through this area. Juvenal, of course, complained about this foreign influx in his satires, but the Romans actually had a long tradition of cultural inclusiveness, especially in the area of religion. Ostia has the usual pagan deities, such as Hercules, Ceres, the goddess of grain, so unnatural there, the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, his consort Juno, and the goddess Minerva, and so on. But the foreign deities are very evident as well, including Magna Mater, Attis, who was the consort of Magna Mater or Cybele, Isis and Serapis from Egypt, for whom a sanctuary was created here in 123 AD. The connections between Alexandria and Ostia and the protections Serapis was believed to give to the grain fleet make a sanctuary to him a natural choice. I think that the building of the sanctuary of Serapis here at Ostia is directly related to the Emperor Hadrian, emperor from 117 to 138, who went to Alexandria, visited the Serapeum, and brought that cult back. Although Hadrian is not responsible for the building of the sanctuary at Ostia, I think his bringing it here is one of the factors that led to the spread of Serapis. And so Alexandria, as one of the terminuses of one of the terminals of the grain trade, is linked to Ostia, and so it's natural, I think, that deities from Egypt would flow here. One of the most widespread of the foreign cults, however, was the worship of Mithras, the god of light. This cosmological deity with roots in Persia was worshipped at Ostia in the 18 underground Mithraea found so far. In addition, another 100 monuments to Mithras have been discovered in the excavations. These are individual statues and private votives and so on. So we have 18 sanctuaries and over 100 other freestanding monuments. This male-only congregational cult seems to have been particularly popular at Ostia. This is surprising since, by contrast, there is no evidence for it at Pompeii. Perhaps it lies there in the 1/3 of the city still awaiting excavation. But nevertheless, Mithras is worshipped all across the city here at Ostia. It has really penetrated the entire city. From at least the middle of the 1st century AD, there was a synagogue at Ostia as well. As preserved, and it's very well preserved today, this small structure included a kitchen, a study room, a vestibule, a courtyard with a very shallow basin for ritual purification, the synagogue itself, and a shrine of the Torah. On one of the brackets for the Torah shrine, you can still make out among the decorations a menorah and a shofar. Interestingly, although it's placed outside the walls of the city near the sea, the names of all those who made dedications at the synagogue were in Latin. That is, the Jews at Ostia seem to have all taken Latin names. Although they're preserving their religious identity in the synagogue, they are also adopting a Roman identity in their naming practices. Although we don't usually think of it as such, Christianity was for centuries seen as an Eastern religion by the Romans. There's ample evidence of Christianity at Ostia beginning in the 3rd century, although most of the remains are from the 4th or 5th. Prior to the 4th century and the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, Christianity was practiced in homes, and so far none of the structures of the 2nd century preserve evidence of it. It's possible that we just don't know what to look for. What would distinguish a house that had Christian worship in it? It's an interesting question and one that we really can't tell. But certainly by the 4th and 5th century, Christianity is found throughout. Well, Ostia, the harbor town of Rome, revealed a very different social, economic, and cultural makeup than we find in Rome itself in AD 120. This city of 50,000 people preserves a remarkable set of domestic units, ranges of apartments for workers, both what we consider the lower and middle class, almost all of whom live in these new 3 to 4 story insulae with no evidence of dwellings for either the very rich or the very poor. The warehouses that stored the bulk commodities destined for Rome physically dominated the city in place of characteristically Roman civic and entertainment buildings. Its religious spaces were given over to sanctuaries of cults from the Eastern Mediterranean, including Mithras from Persia, Magna Mater from, in modern terms, Turkey, Isis and Serapis from Egypt, Judaism, and eventually Christianity. Finally, most surprisingly, I think, or importantly, public benefaction at Ostia was practiced by its trade unions, not by wealthy members of the community. The more I think about it, the more remarkable and important I find Ostia to be. It provides a model community based on a service industry in which there is virtually no poverty and amazingly flat social and economic hierarchies. That is a working and middle-class community that prospered under an efficient and relatively hands-off central government, which stepped in to help in times of disaster, but otherwise the community looked to its own members for investment and beneficence. I can't help but wonder if we couldn't take some lessons from Ostia today in our own cities. Ironically, to find a community much closer to Rome in terms of social, economic, and cultural identity, we have to travel much further away, to the site of the colony of Timgad in modern Algeria. That amazingly well-preserved city will be the subject of our next lecture.